Welcome back to another edition of the Here We Go podcast. I am your host, Trent Ging. Today, I'm going to pick up a little bit from where the live conversation ended yesterday. So we brought up a little bit about salary cap and positions that we may want to see some of that salary cap used on. So going into this 2025 season as of right now, the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to have a little over $40 million that are going to be available to spend. And depending on what they do contractually, they could create up to $85 million. I've seen some reports close to 90. I don't know if that's completely accurate or not. But I mean, even at $80 million, it's more than what we normally have to play with as an organization going into an off season. And so I looked at some of the team needs, and we talked about top 5 needs yesterday. We talked a little bit about Justin Fields obviously being a guy that we all think is going to be brought back to be the starting quarterback in 2025. You expect some of that cap space to be used on him. I have a feeling a 2-year, $30 million deal could get this thing done. I'm hoping it gets done prior to the March free agency starting. I think there's enough motivation from both sides of this thing just to get it done and over with before the free agency starts. Justin said he wants to be here. I honestly believe him when he says he doesn't want to learn a new offense again. I mean, look where he's come from and what he's gone through. It wouldn't make a ton of sense for him to continue to try to do this over and over and over again. Some stability can really help him in his career and his growth and his development. So I really think that deal should get done. I think it should get done sooner rather than later. And so from there, where else should we spend money in free agency? One of the areas I think that I'm most intrigued to see, we talk a lot about drafting a wide receiver in the first round. And all last year, every Steeler fan talked about how there was nothing behind George Pickens. And Colin mentioned it yesterday too, and there is a pretty big talking point on that, and I'm not sure I 100% agree with Colin. I totally get where he's coming from. The history of his argument supports his argument. And that's simply that outside of one season, Arthur Smith's offenses have not had 2 viable wide receivers. But I also feel like Arthur Smith's offenses have never had 2 viable wide receivers to create, 2 successful seasons. Like, I look at the guys he's had. He's not had a ton of guys that have talent that you would consider top-end wide receiver rooms. I mean, he's always kind of bottom of the barrel as far as his wide receiver cores have been concerned. And even when he had 2,000-yard receivers, Corey Davis was not a good receiver. But he made it work with he and A.J. Brown. So I do think there's something there. If you find the right guy that can distribute the ball, I think his offense can work. I think that the game plan is to be more like what Jalen Hurts is to the Eagles, and Devonta Smith being the other guy doesn't mean he's going to get 1,000 yards, but you have to have somebody with more than 500 yards. I mean, that's not a viable number 2. And I mean, we didn't even get that out of Van Jefferson. Dude didn't even crack 400 yards. So I would like to see us spend in free agency on the wide receiver position. And if you look at some of the guys that are going to be available, you got some guys on the wrong side of 30. A guy like Stephon Diggs, Keenan Allen, Amari Cooper. Those are going to be some of the top names you're probably going to see coming up on that list. The guy everyone wants us to see this team attack in free agency, and I mean attack in a very literal sense. Like, I want this team to go after him guns a-blazing. T. Higgins obviously is the number 1 guy who's going to be on the market. I think that he's 26 years old. He's a guy who's going to be able to grow with the offense. And if you're not spending a ton of money on your quarterback, and we're not spending hardly any money on the offense in general, why not try to make a splash and get another wide receiver? If you keep George Pickens, then you keep George Pickens and you have 2 high-end wide receivers in the same room. If you're going to trade George Pickens, you need a replacement for him. You've got to have a 1-for-1 replacement if the trade is even going to happen. So I don't think you're going to do a trade between two high-end receivers with George Pickens and somebody from another team, because nobody's giving up receivers. It's just not in the cards. Like, if you're going to give up a receiver, you're going to give up a guy who's disgruntled on his way out of town, doesn't want to be in the organization anymore, last year of his contract. And you just don't want to go down the road where now you're going to have to pay two guys or trade George for a year to get another player that you have for a year. I mean, again, I still feel like this team has a lot of work to do before they actually are ready to contend for a Super Bowl. I said that at the beginning of last year. I'm saying it right now. You don't sell out in that type of a trade, which means as much as I really think that they still want to trade George Pickens, they're just pigeonholed because of this. Keep him. If you get a guy like T. Higgins and then you can draft a guy in the first round, then the trade can happen. So I think the team needs to go after Higgins regardless, because either you don't trade George and you have two really good wide receivers like I just mentioned, or getting a guy like T. Higgins gives you some leverage to trade George Pickens. You can go get your wide receiver in the first round of this draft. You have 2 second-round picks to fill corner and defensive line, more than likely, in the second round. And then you've got a whole list of picks after that to help fill out the rest of this roster. Again, I think just wide receiver makes the most sense to spend money on. Another position I could see them spending money on, I totally agree with what Colin said yesterday, offensive guard. Isaac Seumalo, this is going to be probably the last year we have him if he doesn't retire. I don't know that he's going to retire. I just heard somebody mention, like, it's very possible maybe he just decides this is it for him. But either way, I still think 2025 is the last year we're going to see Isaac Seumalo in a Steelers jersey. Mason McCormick, how comfortable do you feel with him being your starter all year? I've tried to talk to a couple people, and they really feel strongly that Mason McCormick is going to be the starter going into 2025. To me, a fourth-round rookie shouldn't have been starting this year anyway. You shouldn't feel comfortable with that guy going into the next season. And I think you should want to create some competition for that guy one way or another through the draft, which I think is going to be kind of an under the radar storyline, as I do think guard is on the table for a draft pick. May not be a high draft pick, but I think it's a possibility they draft a guard in this class. But I could absolutely see spending some money on a guard, maybe to come in as a starter. Would James Daniels be healthy anytime early in the season where you feel like giving him a contract? If not, can you re-sign him for cheap anyway? I would love to have James Daniels back one way or another. So there'll be a lot of moving parts with that position, I think, throughout this offseason. Outside of that, though, I mean, I'm not that interested in spending a ton of money on defense. The only other position I could really see spending money on it would be cornerback, either in the slot or outside. I know a lot of people are going to look at Corey Trice as a potential replacement, his injury history. Jeff mentioned this in the podcast yesterday when he was on with us as a guest. How do you trust that injury history? You can't. You have to have a backup plan. Dante Jackson just was not very good this year. It's pretty apparent why Carolina was pretty much done with him. I think Pittsburgh's going to kind of say thanks for being the bridge guy, but we no longer need your services. So, who do you bring in at corner? Mike Hilton's going to be a guy who is possibly going to hit the market. Would you want to bring a guy like that in? Carlton Davis is going to be a guy that I would be intrigued with. I actually wanted them to make a trade for him before. I would really like to see if they can make a move for him. I think he would be a nice addition with Joey Porter Jr. on the outside. We still would probably need to look at possibly upgrading the slot, but I really think Carlton Davis would be a guy that I'd keep an eye on in that scenario. Outside of that, you need another backup safety. You could get that through the draft. You could probably get that through a free agent. I'd probably personally look at some kind of a free agent addition there, especially because our team does like to run a 3 safety rotation. I think that could be appealing to a guy who's not going to be a guaranteed starter, but maybe as a quality player. I think that would be something that would be interesting. I would get a guy who can actually do coverage, maybe run a little bit, unlike Damontae Kazee, who is, runs like a 5.9 40. I swear there was freaking offensive linemen sometimes getting upfield faster than he was. But I think that could be a position, and possibly even, I guess, on offense, going back to offense is one that's just popping in my head as we're talking, but maybe even tight end. I haven't really dug into the tight end group yet. I actually have tight end on my radar for the draft, which I think probably a lot of people aren't going to talk about. Not a ton of quality names, and tight end's probably not going to be one of the free agent signings. But I actually have a pretty nice little list of guys that I look at tight end, even early on. I think you could look at some guys early on, drafting maybe a little ahead of schedule in that position if guys are available. Tyler Warren would be a guy that I would be really, really interested in. If he's available at 20, you need a playmaker. You need to add playmakers on this offense for sure. If you feel like you're drafting to set up your offensive line, Jeff Cullen and I talked about that a good bit yesterday. So you need to add playmakers. If you can get a guy like Emeka Egbuka, Matthew Golden, if you can get a Tyler Warren, or even maybe a Colston Loveland, I'm pulling the trigger. That might be crazy, but I'm pulling the trigger on one of those guys because I really think that adds to your offense, and we need to add to the offense. Deep running back class. I would not be drafting a running back early. I think a lot of people were talking about drafting a running back in the second or third round. I 100% would not. I would move completely away from that notion. Depending on how free agency plays out before the draft, I could change that. If they fill a lot of these holes, if they go in and cornerback maybe, for example, is no longer a need. Okay, so that takes one off the table. Maybe you do move up a little bit for where your original plan was for drafting a running back. But to be perfectly honest with you, I think I would double up on the defensive line. You need a defensive lineman as a starter right now because I don't believe Larry Ogunjobi is going to be back. I think they're going to cut him. Cameron Hayward, being an older guy, he's going to be going into his 37-year-old season. I would just double up the defensive line. It's a super deep draft in that position. I would absolutely have no qualms or quarrels about drafting that position twice. And I honestly wouldn't even care if you told me we took a first and a fourth rounder. I think it's such a need. And a lot of our episode yesterday was talking about building the trenches out. We definitely need work on the defensive side of the football on that D line. I would 100% look at that. That would absolutely be on my radar. I would really, really, really be in favor of picking up a Carlton Davis, not necessarily drafting. You still have Corey Trice as your depth. Corey can play in some sub packages. And if Corey beats him out to be the starter, great. That's a really good problem to have. If you have a guy like Carlton Davis that you end up bringing in here, and then Corey Trice beats him out and stays healthy all season, all right, great. Then we didn't have to waste a draft pick anyway. Slot corner might be something. Beanie Bishop, man, I don't know. I really like Beanie Bishop. I root for that guy. But if you can get an upgraded slot corner, I would. So even drafting a guy, not necessarily in the first round, but if you can get a guy early on in this draft that's going to be a better prospect than Beanie Bishop, maybe you take that chance. A guy that'd be really intriguing for me because we need safety help, because we need slot corner help, Jordan Hancock from Ohio State. I love that kid. I mean, I know I'm going to be a Buckeye homer on some of this, but I just think he's super, super versatile. He can do so much. He was a pretty dang good slot corner just in general, but then he played a lot of safety here in the back half of the season, and he played very well in that safety role, I thought. So he's a kid that's going to be really intriguing. And I don't think he's going to be very high on a lot of draft boards, but he's a guy I'd be really interested in looking to bring in for some competition for Beanie Bishop, certainly. But it's just like, I think you can take some chances. Spending money is kind of the point of this, because when you look at where the needs are, you don't want to make the defense older. I think this draft is going to be very defense oriented, because I think they're going to try to get this defense a little bit younger. You got Cam Hayward, you've got TJ Watt, you've got Larry Ogunjobi, who's probably going to get cut. You need to replace him. You've got a guy like Minkah Fitzpatrick, who's not getting younger. Casey's going to be out the door. You've got to start getting a little bit younger on the defensive side of the football. And I think that's kind of where we need to go with this. And so I won't be surprised that even though we need so much offensive help, if defense ends up being the focus of the draft. If you look at some of the stuff that's coming out of the Senior Bowl this week, they're very heavily focused on defensive line. So I'm just telling y'all right now, do not be upset when there are 2 defensive line draft coming out within the first 5 rounds. I think it's very possible. Long way to go. But looking at things logically, you can throw some money at a guard. Guards aren't going to demand top dollar, so it's not going to be a big spend. Do you want to bring in a tackle? Do you not believe in the young tackles yet? I don't think the team's going to do that. You invested 2 first-round picks, so you're not going to bring in a tackle. You might bring in a swing tackle, and I absolutely would bring in a veteran swing tackle, but that's cheap. I mean, you're talking, $5 million. That's not going to eat into $90 million or $85 million or $80 million, whatever this final number is going to end up being. Justin Fields is going to cut into some of it. Like I said, a wide receiver, which I absolutely hope we do, is going to cut into some of it. But where else are you going to put the money? It'd be cornerback. That'd be the next big spend. So I think we can take some swings in free agency. If we feel like guys are a good fit, I think you can pay some of these guys. And quite frankly, I think you could almost even look at overpaying. I don't like to overpay. But if you want to overpay for a guy like T. Higgins, who has only played 67% of his career games, I'm okay with taking that shot. Just because look where we were last year. Look where we are this year. Where do we want to be? How do we want to contend? If you feel like there's any notion that Justin Fields is possibly going to be your guy, give him some weapons to work with. If you don't feel like Justin Fields is going to be your guy, then guess what? Build your roster out for the next guy anyway. No matter what you do, you still have to have pieces in order to contend in the NFL. So that's kind of all I have for today. I'm just going to kind of preview an episode of tomorrow. Tomorrow, Colin and I will be back live once again. We have another special guest with us. It is Zachary Smith. Zachary Smith, famous for Around the 412 podcast, as well as the Afternoon Drive with Alan Saunders. So excited to get him back on. It'll be the 3rd time he's been on with us. So it'll be fun to have him on, talk a little more Steelers football. So until then, hope you all like, share, subscribe, leave some comments. Give me some ideas if you guys want us to talk about anything in particular or want me to talk about anything individually. I'd love to hear what your thoughts are. Other than that, have a great night.